Hi, everybody. This is our 26th free performance thinking webinar. And I continue to be amazed that we've been doing this for this long, but I think we have a pretty good collection of them now on our YouTube channel also. So this is about optimizing return on investment. I'm sure that's what you signed up for. What's interesting to me about this topic is that a lot of people talk about ROI. And there's, the ROI Institute that talks about evaluating ROI and so forth. But it's not really clear that people think a lot about how to optimize ROI. And over the years, we've seen that using our performance thinking models and approach, we can pretty dramatically improve the impact of the kind of interventions that we do. And so what we decided to do this month was to sort of unpack that and to show you how we think about it and to see if this might be helpful to you all. So here's the agenda. I want to talk a little bit about kind of what are the challenges? Like, why doesn't this happen? Why are there questionable return on investment or sort of unknown or kind of weak return on investment for various things, training and non-training interventions for human performance? And then I want to kind of provide at a high level some of the elements of performance thinking and how they can help, and then sort of step you through how we go about it. And many of you in this group already know about this, I think, because you're already either practitioners or have been aware of our programs for a while. And then summarize it with some key takeaways, and then we should have some time for Q&A. I hope there is some Q&A. I hope people will think about this and sort of challenge or ask questions at the end, because I always like to leave time for that. But it isn't always the case that people respond. And by the way, I apologize if I start coughing or sneezing at any point here. I've just caught a cold in the last couple of days from my dear son, and so I'm trying to manage all that. Anyway, before we get into it, I want to remind you, and I think everybody here pretty much knows, but our YouTube channel, which you can reach by going to performancethinking.tv, has a lot of videos on it. It has all of these webinars that we've done. It also has some short playlists on things like performance consulting, sales performance, coaching, and so forth. We're hoping to get back to the short playlist. One of the things that's been brought to my attention, and I've sort of known this, but an hour-long webinar is a lot to watch. And I understand how people might go to the website and say, oh my gosh, these are too long. I don't have time for this. And I understand that, although I have a couple suggestions about it. One is if you just look across the full scope. If you click on webinars when you get to the YouTube channel and you kind of look at the full scope, there may be some topics that are immediately relevant to you that you might find worth spending some time on. The other thing that I recognize is, more and more people do so-called podcasts using video as well as audio. And I've experimented with this a little bit myself, sort of logging into YouTube on my phone and setting it up someplace in my car so I can listen to it. You don't always have to listen to the slides. So some of these might be very helpful for those of you who commute or drive distances that allow you to listen to stuff, or even while you're cleaning the house or whatever. Anyway, there's lots of stuff on YouTube. And we got more webinars coming. One of the things we want to talk about at some point is this notion that comes out of really a lot of the employee engagement research about the fact that really, you work for your manager. Your manager controls a lot of your life at work. And so what are the implications of that? And then we want to talk about this word systemic. It's one of those words that people use a lot in all kinds of contexts. They say, oh, that's systemic. Well, what does that mean? A lot of times it just means big or complicated, but we have a particular perspective on what that means that I think many of you can probably guess. But it'd be interesting to have that conversation. And then a recurring theme, really, which is really sort of the flip side of this conversation today, which is, why training often doesn't deliver the goods. And there's a lot more. Next month, I'm going to kind of stick my neck out a little bit in the sense that I spent about 35 years before I really got deeply into performance improvement, looking at what we call fluency building or building fluent performance. And then when I got involved in the 80s and early 90s in human performance improvement, we began to apply some of the things we know about building performance. And there's a whole bunch of articles. Some of them are at our our performancethinking.com website and the resource library, but fluency.org is this kind of hobby pro bono website that we've had since I think 1996. And there's a whole bunch of unpublished stuff, and a huge amount of it has to do with kids' education because I started out in that world back in the 70s. And that's where a lot of the research was done. But we then brought that into the corporate world and sales and customer service and some other areas. And so there's a lot to be said about this topic. And I've hesitated about it in a way because sometimes I feel like a bit of a fraud. Those of you who've been through our programs recognize that we often don't explicitly build fluency in the way we think we should. Part of it is because those programs were traditionally classroom programs. And to really build fluency, you need a little bit of practice every day over some period of time. But secondly, then when you go virtual, it's even a little trickier. But we have plans to change that over the next year or so. In any case, I think it's a topic you might find interesting and very different from things you're accustomed to. And you can register for these webinars, as you all know. If you go to our homepage on the website, the little thing on the right side, Performance Thinking free webinars, you click on that and you can register. So let's get down to it. So, I'm not sure what you all think about this, but my observation, having worked with an awful lot of clients over the last 50 years, shockingly that long, in a lot of different industries, big and small, is that there's a lot of real questions about whether performance interventions deliver return on investment, and a lot of times it's questionable as to whether they do or whether even measure it. And so what are some of those challenges? What gets in the way of this? So I wanted to list a few of the obstacles that we think exist in terms of optimizing ROI. And one of them is, and everybody here is probably familiar with this, but the sort of knee-jerk reliance on training as the performance intervention. You speak with senior leaders, or you speak with managers in departments, et cetera. And they say, well, I got a performance issue, train them. Well, okay, but first of all, we're not sure that skills and knowledge are the issue in every case, and we need to do a little bit of analysis. But secondly, of course, a lot of times when people train, even if the learning is effective, they don't support that training on the job. They don't support application on the job. So just this kind of knee-jerk reliance on training is almost guaranteed to produce relatively low return on investment unless you build other parts of the system. The second, and by the way, we have a webinar, if you look in the YouTube channel, about this, getting out of the training box. And we also have a white paper on the same topic. But this really a fundamental thing, which is until you get out of being held into the order taker training box, or if you're a senior leader or stakeholder who asks training departments to do things, don't just be, just ask them to do training. Ask them to take a look at what might be needed and also participate in things other than training. So that's one of the first obstacles. A second one, and it's kind of related, is that in many organizations, there's a bunch of different groups, teams, departments that in one way or the other are responsible for supporting performance. But a lot of times they're in silos. I mean, I can't tell you how often I've worked with, training departments who are asked by the process people at the very end of the thing to do some training, or how often I've looked at sales organizations where expectations were set at the front of the room by the VP of sales about some new product, and the salespeople looked in their comp plans and they didn't see anything about consequences for selling that product. It was a lot easier for them to sell the old stuff that they know about already, or systems where things actually run cross purposes to one another. And so the challenge, and I used to work a lot with large corporations, Microsoft, Genentech, other companies, on big product launches, sales product launches. It would be interesting to go to a product launch meeting and see all the different players that were involved, marketing, sales training, sales operations, IT, field coaching, et cetera, all these different groups and folks who are responsible for some aspect of supporting performance. And yet they were not aligned. They were all just kind of doing the same thing they usually did. Now, maybe you've been in organizations where it wasn't so bad, and I recognize that there's, a spectrum here. But one of the things is that folks who pull the levers to support performance are often not staying very closely connected with one another so that it all fits together. This leads to, and often is associated with, what I would call uncoordinated interventions, and frankly, flavor of the year. One of the things, just even in the last several years, I've noticed this, because as we get all kinds of new gizmos, whether it's, learning in the flow, or, gamification, or the 5 points of need, or whatever it is, people adopt something that is the current thing, that there's a current book out about, or there's a workshop they go to, or is the topic at the conference or whatever, and they come back and say, well, let's do this, But the thing is, this, whatever it is very often just one piece of the system. And if you don't align and coordinate all the other factors, you're not going to get a very good payoff. The other thing, of course, and I think those of you in the training business will probably be pretty familiar with this, is a lot of times people design interventions, often training programs, but maybe other things, and they just kind of put them out there. They say, okay, we've done it now. And they don't actually even check back very much. They often don't iterate. They're thank you very much, we're done, on to the next thing. And I think it's fair to say that even if we're brilliant performance analysts, we often miss stuff. And we also often learn things when we actually implement programs or interventions that we either got wrong or could have improved, or we get feedback from participants and we say, oh, that would make it better, wouldn't it? But if we don't actively iterate, if we don't actively apply this agile notion of continuous improvement, we're going to miss it. And so we probably aren't going to get the ROI we'd like. In fact, one of my favorite bits about that, one of our largest clients, longest clients, over a dozen years we've worked with them, is a very large biotech company. And they've got something like 300 certified performance thinking practitioners that they've certified over the years. And some years ago, the head of that community came to our summer institute and talked about adding the S to ADDIES. And some of you who are in training probably know about the acronym ADDIE: Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, and Evaluation. And what they added was the S for sustainment. And what they did is, and they've done this now for some years, is pretty much on any intervention, on any delivery, whether it's a training or non-training or some combination of the things, they will essentially contract with their stakeholders, and they'll say, look, we're gonna kick this thing off, we're gonna flip the switch, turn it on, make it happen. And but we want to come back in 6 weeks or 8 weeks or some amount of time to be sure that it's still working. Excuse me for a moment, I'm sorry. This cold is getting me. And what will happen is, of course, they don't always get it right. One of my favorite ones at the biotech company was they implemented big global project to implement in their R&D labs electronic note-taking systems, as opposed to the old paper ones. And so when they went back on their check about 6 weeks or 8 weeks later, at least it was described to me, they discovered they had people who said, well, we tried this electronic thing, but we didn't really like it very much. So we went back to the old system. It's like, wait a minute, you got to turn off the old system. You got to make it both attractive to use the new one, but also maybe limit people's ability to go back to the old one. That's just a simple thing that, if you hadn't thought about it, that will undermine your impact. And then finally, I would say, and I think most people here would agree, that certainly in most training efforts, but shockingly in a lot of other interventions, there's just not very good measurement. They do rating scales, or subjective smile sheet things, or they use competencies where you're rating, is he a 4 or a 5 on strategic thinking? Well, that's not a measure of performance. That's refined opinion. And so there's very often even a lack of a measurement that allows you to make good decisions to continuously improve. Now, these are just some of the things, and there's certainly others. But the question is, if we're going to try to fix this, we got to get some clarity. We got to be sure we know what we're analyzing, what we're looking at, the performance we're trying to improve, how we're going to do it. And so where do we start with that? That's in a certain way, that's kind of the practical question. So we start with accomplishments. We start with Tom Gilbert. And most of you who are in the room here know about Tom Gilbert, I think, and Tom no longer with us, but he wrote this book, Human Competence, back in 1978, that is still taught in graduate schools. And it's chock full of ideas. It's been the core concepts have been refined by a number of people, including our group, over the years, but it's still quite relevant. And Tom made this earth-shaking assertion, which I think is absolutely correct. He said, in the great cult of behavior, behavior is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. And he didn't mean behaviorists. He meant everybody. He meant trainers, leaders, managers, you name it. We're all focused on people's behavior. And he said, but we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. So that was earth-shaking, and not everybody took it to heart. We still have performance improvement professionals who are not focused on accomplishments, really. They might vaguely talk about being focused on results, but this was had enormous impact, and I want to talk about some of the implications of it. We, some years ago, coined the phrase work outputs, and I think most of the people in this group know about that. But we coined this term years ago, work outputs, because what we found was when we looked in the literature of performance improvement or organizational behavior management, et cetera, and we looked at how the word accomplishments was used, it was all over the board. Sometimes it was big business results. Sometimes it was concrete things that you could, measure and count. Sometimes it was other stuff. And so it was kind of fuzzy if you're trying to teach people to define and identify accomplishments, what they were. So we used the phrase work outputs. And the reason we do it is a couple things. One is, if you look up the word accomplishment in the dictionary, there are actually more meanings of it that are about the completion of behavior than the products of behavior. And what Tom was talking about was the products of behavior. So we talk about work outputs, which sounds a little bit more like the product of some activity. But more importantly, it's a plural noun, a plural phrase. And so we think that unless an accomplishment is countable, unless it's something that you can say, here's a good one, and here's not such a good one, that it's very hard to measure, and it's very hard to define, and it's very hard to tell if it's any good. So we use that phrase. And as you'll see, it sort of works through most of all of our work. Tom had a great thing, which actually I just realized in my animation, turning my animated PowerPoints into slides, or rather PDF pages, which is what Webinar Jam prefers. I did not include the animation, but Tom's actual formula was the worth of an intervention is equal to the value of the accomplishments divided by the cost of behavior. And then click, you get this animation, which says the modern way, the current way of talking about that is return on investment. And so the notion is that accomplishments, if they are accomplishments that actually contribute to the organization's results, are valuable. That's where the value is. Behavior is costly. It costs us to hire people, to train them, to onboard them, to give them computers and equipment and environment and workspace and the salary and all the rest of it. And so the core concept here is if we're accomplishment based, we're focusing on value. And if we're trying to optimize return on investment, we want to get the greatest improvement or increase in accomplishments with the least cost to support the behavior, which does not mean we want to be slave drivers. It just means we want to find systems which enable people to optimize their performance and the products of their activity with the least expense, basically. So, when we talk about work outputs, there's a lot of different places we find them, and that's part of the analysis process. You can look at all the outputs or the accomplishments that an individual produces. You can look at the contributions of a team. You can look at processes and define the outputs of each step in that. We have a colleague, Peter Doms, with whom we did a webinar some months ago about strategic objectives as accomplishments or outputs. If you're doing implementation or project plans, presumably you have milestones, which should be things that you produce or achieve. And they may be very concrete things like widgets or deliverables or documents, but they may also be less concrete things that are nonetheless countable nouns like decisions, relationships, etc. But they're things that you need people or processes or groups to produce. Training objectives, in my opinion, should be accomplishments. It should be at the end of this training, you will be able to produce a better relationship, good hiring decisions, a budget that meets the criteria around here, whatever it is. Same with coaching and so forth. So we find outputs all over the place, but they're the value that people's performance delivers. Now, performance thinking models and logic, that's what we teach. That's what we've refined over the last 25 years. And so I want to show you how, given those challenges that I mentioned, and given a starting place with accomplishments, sort of how the elements of performance thinking can really help you optimize ROI. The first thing is the first model of performance thinking, the performance chain. And we often describe it as how behavior produces business results, because we start with the end in mind. We want to know for any given intervention, for any given project, for any given coaching interaction, what are we trying to accomplish for the business, or maybe for the society? But in most cases, it's for the organization. And so we can measure those things. But those are the things that matter. Why are we doing this again? Is it to increase revenue or market share? Or are we trying to get better customer satisfaction? What's the point of whatever it is we're doing? And then there's the work outputs of the accomplishments. In order to produce those, there's the behavior for producing them. Behavior is very important. It's just we want to be sure it's the behavior to produce the work outputs. And then we have all this stuff we call behavior influences that are in place, or we try to put in place to support it. So that's our basic model of what performance is, but we anchor it all to work outputs or accomplishments. We start with that. We want to be sure we've got accomplishments that are the product of behavior that actually contribute to business results. And that will guide us to behavior, which is the first sort of point about ROI, really. If you start with skills and knowledge, if you start with competencies, if you start with behavior, you can ask the question, for what? What are these things supposed to produce? If instead you start with accomplishments or work outputs and you define what a good one is, that will guide you to the behavior you need, and it will also guide you to those other things like skills and knowledge. So once we identify the work outputs, we get guided to specific behavior needed to produce them. We don't have a whole bunch of stuff. We just say, no, this is what produces these outputs efficiently and effectively. And if we define what we call criteria for good, if we say these are the criteria for good funding decision, this is the criteria for a good budget or proposal, these are the criteria for a good working relationship between peers in the organization, whatever it is, if we define what the criteria or standards for good are, then that even sharpens it more, because it helps us look for the behavior needed to produce things to that level of quality, quantity, and so forth. And if we look for exemplary behavior, which is something that Tom Gilbert taught us to do, which is we say, wait a minute, are there individuals or teams here who produce accomplishments at a much higher level of quantity and quality than average, like a big difference? If so, first of all, there's an enormous potential, because we can raise the average toward those people's performance. But secondly, we should study those people's performance and see how they do it. We can't be, Michael Jordans or Kobe Bryant's. We can't turn everybody into the superstars, but we can learn how they do some of the critical things they do, and we can enable other people to do those things. And so again, when we start out with work outputs and we define the value in that way, now we can focus on the right behavior, and that tends to produce things that are leaner and with greater return on investment. Now, the other part of our thing, of course, is the 6 boxes model, which evolved from Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model. But we would argue that it is a complete framework for behavior influences, that there's nothing that exists in a performance environment or the history of a performer or what we do to help them perform now that doesn't fit into either one of these cells or some combination of them. And so we have a complete framework, and that has enormous impact, because if we look at all those things, if we don't just say, oh, we're going to do a skills and knowledge intervention, or we're going to do a process intervention, change the process. If we just do one thing or even two things, we're missing the boat, because these things are highly interactive. This is a system. And here's a very high level summary of all of the positive behavior influences possible to support performance. And when we train performance analysts, we have them look for this stuff. We have them say what's working and what's not. But the point is that it really is a system. And often, some of you know, I have an animated version of this slide, but these are all connections. If you set expectations, you better be sure they're aligned with the consequences or the recognition of doing well. If you, if you set expectations, you better be sure to give people the tools and resources they need to accomplish them, or they're going to not trust you. If you give people clear expectations and frequent feedback, they may actually develop skills and knowledge without you having to take them off the job and do formal training. If you understand people's motives and preferences, that will enable you to do the other stuff better, and so forth. So there are connections between all of these things. This is the system part of it. And if we make them positive and align them, there's a much higher probability of getting the effect, and also at lower cost. Because, for example, training, skills and knowledge interventions can be very expensive. And if you're carrying the whole weight with that, they're not only expensive, but they may not quite do the trick. Whereas if you look at the top row and you say, wait a minute, we got some training we have to do here, but we better have our managers and supervisors set expectations, provide feedback about doing the new thing, be sure that the tools are working for people, recognize when they do it well. If we don't do that stuff, probably the payoff for skills and knowledge is not going to be very significant. In fact, one of the things that I often say to stakeholders and new clients when they ask for training and they say, oh, just give us the training, we don't want any other stuff, is, wait a minute, you want to get a return on this, don't you? You want to have an effect. So if you're going to invest in training, let's work with your managers and supervisors to be sure they're doing stuff on that top row, because otherwise it's hit or miss. Now, that does bring up this topic, which is, and this is probably the biggest challenge. Those of you, I think just about everybody who I recognize in this group here are in some way or other performance consultants, and or maybe training professionals who are functioning in performance consulting roles. And I think to become a performance consultant, there's sort of two challenges. One is you have to learn about a set of skills and tools and a process about how to do performance analysis more broadly than just training needs analysis. And that's what we teach in our performance thinking practitioner program, and what others learn in different performance consulting kinds of programs and studies. But that's in some ways the easy part. The hard part sometimes is engaging leaders and managers in doing their part. Because at least from my perspective, the role of a leader or manager, independent of performance improvement, just day to day, is about arranging conditions, as illustrated in this picture by the 6 boxes model, to optimize both the productivity and the engagement of their employees, of their team members. And so if we're performance professionals and we're designing, let's say, skills and knowledge interventions or new job aids in box 2, or maybe we're helping develop a new hiring methodology for box 5, process, or whatever we're doing with people, we need leaders and managers to participate, to collaborate with us. And that's very often difficult. But the people that I coach and work with in our kind of growing global network, we work a lot to help them find ways to engage leaders and managers so that the light goes on with these people and they say, oh, wait a minute, I see. We're focusing on the valuable contributions that people make. That makes sense. Or, oh, I see. We can train them. But, if the managers aren't setting expectations and providing feedback, we may not get much impact. So if we can engage leaders and managers as performance professionals, in our role, then we have a much bigger chance of making all those things work together. And again, higher ROI, I would argue. Now, there's another piece too, and that's what next month's thing is going to be about, which is building fluent performance. This article that we have on our website and has been around for a while is a good example of building fluent performance, because it was really optimal. It was kind of one of these all the stars line up thing, where my co-author for that article, Lee Sweeney, was actually the business unit manager of a AT&T wireless call center. And they were hiring new customer reps really fast. It was in the relatively early days of cell phone companies. It was like, I think maybe I forget what year that was published, but it was, it was 12 years ago, something like that, at least. And there were a couple of interesting things about it. First of all, we focused very much on the accomplishments or the outputs that customer service people needed to produce, answers to questions, revised account records in the system, solutions that could be, appropriate transfers to specialists in the companies. These were all essentially outputs, and we focused on those. And then we said, what do people need in order to produce those optimally? And one of the things we discovered, which is kind of obvious when you think about it, is in many customer service training programs, even if they do a good job on the other stuff, they often just kind of let people learn about the system over time. They might give them some instruction, but typically customer service reps and call centers have got maybe three or four or five different systems they're interacting with. And they're not completely obvious in all cases, and they aren't beautifully designed in all cases. And one of the things that we discovered was if we built fluent behavior components on using the system, it made a huge impact. So, for example, instead of saying, hey, take 20 minutes and do the scavenger hunt, see what you can find in the system, we would give them 20 things to look up, and we'd pair people off, and we'd say, okay, find the account number of John Smith. Okay, good. Find, the current service level of Billy Holiday, whatever it is. And these people got in pieces like that. If you focused on the specific stuff they had to be able to do, they got so they could navigate these systems kind of in their sleep almost during training. And the upshot of that, plus a bunch of other fluency-based interventions about specific things that would otherwise hold people down, was that we were able to used to take 2 months to ramp these people up to benchmark productivity from the time they were hired. We reduced it to 2 weeks and surpassed the benchmark by 60%. And you can read about that. But the point is, if you insert a bit of building fluency, efficient practice, and good ergonomics in the right places, you can also maximize ROI in a big way. So let me just review how we do this. With performance thinking. I've sort of identified a few of the elements that can be improved. We have this thing we call performance thinking logic or performance improvement logic. And it's really the logic of how we think about and do stuff with performance. And again, most of you know about this, but, we start out, we want to be sure that we know what's at stake for the business, because that will affect how we do things. That, for example, a simple example in sales, if we're helping our sales team write proposals for a particular product at a particular time, for example, it depends on whether we're going for market share and don't care so much about profitability at this point, because we just want to increase the number of people we have as customers, or if we're going to profitability, because we will either say what you really need is to price this thing to sell, or you need to price it with a certain minimum profitability. So that's a simple example of how business results will affect what we do. So we want to understand that up front. And then we say, let's take a look at the role or the process or the team, whatever it is, and through a series of interviews and observations and so forth, identify the work outputs. And that little circle, let's be sure that those work outputs contribute to business results. Because if they don't, if there's no credible way in which that output contributes to the business result, we might want to get it out of here unless there's some compliance reason for it. It's what lean process people do when they tighten up processes. So we want to identify the work outputs and what criteria for a good one. Then we say, now we know what they need to produce. So we can do a task analysis, we can observe successful performers, we can interview them, we can talk to exemplary performers, we can do a whole bunch of things. But what we're doing is we're identifying the specific behavior needed to produce those outputs. And in being that precise, we are probably making our training and our management and our supervision and our tools leaner because it's more focused. And we're also probably enabling people to get up to speed faster because we're not overburdening them with a whole bunch of skills and knowledge and abstractions that they may or may not need. So again, work outputs or accomplishments guide us to behavior. Now we're in a position to measure. And this is where the measurement thing comes up. We did a webinar on this topic a year and a half ago, I think. But what we teach folks is that Essentially, any of the metrics you would use in your organization fit into one of these three things. They're either measuring some kind of business result, some aggregate measure, usually, ideally at the organizational level, but it could be at the department level. It could be, cycle time in a process. But in any case, there's a business result involved or more than one. And we can measure those, but they're very often lagging indicators. So we don't get to make a lot of decisions because we don't get data points very often. We can measure behavior also. And people do this. They do it when they're training folks. Sometimes they do it, for example, when you're giving feedback to people in customer service or sales jobs. We do it when we're observing people to see if they're exhibiting proper safety behavior. And that's all really important. It's fairly expensive in the sense you have to have video or audio recordings and or observers. But we can do that. But we think work outputs are the sweet spot, because if you can identify the countable things that people are supposed to produce, and if you can identify the criteria for them, now we have a measurement system. We're paying attention to something where we will get data fairly often, maybe daily or weekly, maybe even hourly in some environments. And we can actually look at it and make decisions to improve. And so that supports the iterative agile kind of thing that, for example, instructional designers are always told you're supposed to, assess and revise. Well, we often don't do it. Part of it is because we don't often have data to guide us. Once we've got that, now we look at the behavior influences. And we have this little mantra. We talk about analyze, brainstorm, and choose behavior influences. And it's really how we apply design thinking or design engineering to performance improvement. Because first of all, you want to know, once you know the behavior needed to produce the outputs, you want to know, what's working and what's not in each of the cells of that model. So you analyze. And then, and this is the thing we introduced maybe 7-8 years ago, we want to brainstorm. We don't want to just jump to the usual suspects, because there may be some interesting things we could do that aren't done all that much, or people haven't thought of. So we want to look at best practices. We want to see what we might have learned from exemplary performers who sometimes arrange their own conditions for learning or performance. We want to maybe ask people elsewhere. There's lots of ways we can get content for brainstorm, but we want to have a robust set of options, which we then ideally choose and configure in collaboration with our stakeholders. And if we go through that process, part of the point of configuring those things is to be sure they all fit together in the 6 boxes, to be sure that they're optimal, and be sure that we pick the most cost-effective options for doing any given thing. And so that's what I mean by configuring behavior influences to optimize ROI. And finally, then, we implement, measure, and adjust for continuous improvement. And if we're measuring, we can iterate and get the thing right. So to me, this is the logic, if you will, of not only performance improvement, but of getting your ROI right. We can extend that, of course, if we really involve managers and leaders. We can take this approach, and we've talked about this before in other webinars, but we can embed that in an entire accomplishment-based talent development process where we're recruiting people based on their history or their ability or potential for producing the outputs that their job needs to produce. We're onboarding them by identifying the outputs they need to be up to speed on over time, focusing on those things and being sure they can do it. We're then training them in whatever ways we need, ideally in ways that enable them to produce the outputs, not just know a lot of stuff or have lots of skills and knowledge. And then we move them into a coaching process, ideally, and we have an accomplishment-based coaching program called the Performance Thinking Coach, where managers or supervisors are working on a regular basis with their folks to identify outputs that need to be improved or added, and continuously using the very models I just showed you, except one-to-one for agile talent development. So this can be driven more deeply into the organization as an ongoing continuous improvement thing. And then your ROI starts to get pretty impressive. So here's some takeaways, and then I hope people will have a few thoughts or questions or comments. One of them is, anchoring analysis and accomplishments focuses on value. And value is the top part of the return on investment equation, and that's what we really want to start with. The second thing is, if we get specific about the behavior, not just general skills and knowledge or what the subject matter experts think or whatever, but actually the behavior we can identify that's needed to produce the accomplishments and drive results as efficiently and effectively as possible. And there's lots of ways to do that, But if our focus is on that, based on the accomplishments people need to produce, then we've got some leverage. And then we use something like, and of course, we don't think it's something like, we think it is the 6 boxes model, to configure a complete set of behavior influences. We want to be sure we haven't missed anything. We can set expectations, but then, oh, by the way, nobody ever recognized that somebody did this well, or they just gave them critical feedback, or have a lousy tool, and so people don't even want to use it, or, we can do skills and knowledge through training, but then, oops, the managers weren't even aware of it, or whatever. No, we want a complete set of behavior influences through collaboration among the players that are relevant. And we want to be iterative. We want to be agile. I get a kick out of the word agile because it was kind of a flavor of the year a few years ago, and it's still out there a lot as a word. But, from agile software development and other such things, it started to be applied to everything. And I remember I went to a regional Association for Talent Development conference a few years ago when Agile was a thing. And I was waiting for the first presentation. I looked in the program. There was something like 29 instances of the word Agile in the program. It's like, oh, everybody's into Agile. But the idea is to be iterative. The idea is to use measurement to make decisions about how to improve, and ideally driving that all the way through to coaching, an ongoing coaching thing. And then, from a measurement point of view, counting work outputs that are good and not so good usually can give you a leading indicator for decision making, and it's often less expensive. Oops. Uh-oh. Have you lost me, Jasmine? Anybody else? Is anybody else not hearing? Uh-oh. Okay. All right. That's good. Thank you for bringing that up there, Jasmine. I really appreciate it, because sometimes I can't tell. All right. Good deal. Anyway, counting work outputs turns out to be easier often than any other kind of measurement. One of my colleagues, Bob Redeker, who's been working with us for a long time, he's at Insperity, and he's a great performance improvement guy. He's a very wise person, but he's been also he's certified to develop performance thinking practitioners, and I think has certified 100 or so at Insperity over the years. And he always says, if we can get our stakeholders to just measure work outputs or accomplishments and count them, it makes measurement a whole lot easier for everybody. And then finally, and I think this isn't finally, I think there's one more at the end, but the whole thing of collaborating with leaders and managers to engage them, to, of course, teach them or encourage them to engage us is another way to think about it, because then we can have a complete set of interventions that optimizes the effect. And finally, this notion of building fluency, which we'll have a lot more to talk about next month. But very often, if you look at some performance, a lot of it is straightforward, but sometimes there's things that actually need practice, using the system, adjusting certain things in a mechanical type of job, writing needs solutions descriptions for proposals, whatever it is. But very often, if you look at a hunk of performance and you say, wait a minute, there's 3 or 4 things here that if they're not quick and easeful, it slows everything down. So let's zero in on that and build fluency on those components. And it turns out the whole rest of it will work a lot better. So that's the deal. A couple of, before we have a Q&A kind of conversation, a couple of shameless commerce things. First of all, we're very excited about our next Performance Thinking Summer Institute, which is going to be June 11th to 15th. It's always in the beginning of June, which is a fantastic place to be here on Bainbridge Island. It's a beautiful place in June, and we do it at Islandwood, which is this stunning 200 and some acre environmental education place in the school year. But when we're there, it's just a wonderful place to eat, to take walks, to hike, etc., in between all the sessions that we do. And as you can see, one of the things we do, we don't actually configure the whole schedule usually until a couple months before it, because we're trying to be relevant and timely. But we know we're going to have our performance coaching program there. We know we're going to have Peter Doms come back and talk about accomplishment-based strategic planning and see what he's continued to learn since last year. We know we're going to talk about sales enablement, which is a big thrust of our work right now. We're going to have a one-day workshop on building fluent performance. And employee engagement and retention are always woven through everything. So we know those are going to be at least themes. And these testimonials on the left are things we literally have gotten from people virtually every year. And this will be our 12th year. Virtually every year, one and sometimes more than one person says, this was the best professional development experience of my career. So it's a big deal. So what I wanted to mention is, and that slightly strange URL at the top, the bit.ly URL, bit.ly/2023 Performance Thinking Summer Institute or PT Summer Institute, that will get you to the registration page. Now, I want to tell you for my friends and colleagues that between now, which is December 21st, and the end of this month, that is the 1st of January or 31st of December, we're offering $1,000 off registration for the program. And the program is about, I think, full price if you don't sign up until May something, is something like $3,500, which covers the program and food and snacks and all that. It doesn't cover lodging, which is a separate expense, but on the site. But we're offering a very low, extremely big discount on this in the next only a couple of weeks left now, because there's a lot of people who come every year. We've had people who've come 8 or 9 years out of the 11 we've done it. And so for those people, or if you've got money, at the end of 2022, which you haven't spent yet, but it'll disappear, come on down. So reach out to us. You can go to that URL and reach out and sign up, because we're happy to give you a big discount if you're interested. And a lot of times we wind up giving discounts toward the end to friends and colleagues, but we'd rather do that up front for a whole bunch of reasons. So anyway, and then the other two things, the other shameless commerce thing, is that we offer open versions of our programs. The practitioner program is starting, the next cohort, the open one, is starting January 9th. And you can find that if you go to performancethinking.com, you can find a little thing on the homepage and click on it and find all the information. We've still got, I think, 3 seats or 4 seats left maybe in it. It's usually a fairly small program anyway, like a dozen people. But if you sign up before Christmas is what it's going to have to be, because it takes us a while to send you materials. We'll give you $500 off the price, and that's the lowest it's been offered in decades. So we're trying to encourage people so we can fill it up. And the other thing is, Shane Isley delivers our coaching program, but for people in behavioral health and applied behavior analysis. That's the market segment that he serves mostly. So if you're interested in that or have colleagues that are, you can sign up for that one. And you can go to Facebook, actually. There's a performance thinking page there, and you can find out more about that. It starts March 28th. So anyway, that's the end of my shameless commerce. So comments, questions, what do you think about ROI? I'm hoping there's at least a few things that people have to say or ask. So Scott, if you're still with us, I'm noticing you talk about fluency in the chat box, and I think your comment implies that it's a missing piece, and that if you build it in manufacturing and elsewhere, you can optimize interventions. Does that make sense from your perspective, what I said about ROI? You can use the chat box to respond is probably the best way to do it. Well, maybe Scott can't hear me. I think Scott had to jump off, so not a surprise. Anyone else comments? Because we don't have to continue. I'm happy to. I think I'm going to turn off the slides and see if anybody has anything to say. We could. I usually don't have audio available for participants because sometimes it's a problem, but I'm going to turn it on. If anybody actually would like to say anything, I just did. I think it will be possible to say something if you ask to speak. Anyone? Yes, that, says Scott. Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, the ROI thing, Jasmine, I think in any environment you're in, I mean, I know you're going outside of real estate now and you're working in a bunch of different environments, but if you think about, for example, those bookkeepers for that colleague of yours, uh, we spoke about the other day, there's got to be components there that are could be made more fluent, both by arranging conditions, tools, resources that are easier to use, and ergonomics part of it, and also by practice if you're bringing new people on. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you everybody for participating. I hope this was useful. I really do think the ROI thing is a big deal because my take on it is that we and our clients often accept unusually low levels of impact, in part because we can't always measure it. We mostly measure whether people liked it or not, and in part because we're usually doing these non-systemic interventions. So, yeah, good point, Scott. All right, thank you, everybody. I think we're done for the day, and I've managed to at least not sneeze. So I'm very happy I didn't blast you out with my sneezing. So take care, and please come back. And next month, I think it's going to be pretty interesting on the fluency topic. So what about putting a dollar value on outputs? I'm just seeing your comment, Scott. Well, I think that's quite doable in some environments. In some places, it's not. But in some places, it definitely is. I think that's a great idea. It depends on what your environment is and what the work outputs are. But even if you just count them and they're valuable, I think you can think about it that way. All right. Thanks, everybody.